So there's a early philosopher, he's also a neuroscientist, his name is Benjamin Libet. And back in the early 80s, he ran a series of experiments that he called the readiness-potential experiments. And they were somewhat simple rather, and subtle and nuanced in what came out of them. But actually, it was earth-shattering in terms of making us look carefully at a debate that's been going on for a long time. The debate between what's known as free will and determinism. An answer that or a debate that many of us feel, in philosophy feel, will never get sufficiently answered. And I think from a conceptual standpoint, we kind of have come to a stalemate. But of course, our practice enables us to see through that conceptual stalemate. But it's not easy to do, because those concepts are large. But here's what he did. He wired people's brains with EEG electrodes and gave them a simple instruction. I don't want you to plan anything. I don't want you to time anything, and I don't even want you to anticipate anything. I just want you to sit there, and at some completely spontaneous moment of your own choosing, just do me a favor and flex your wrist or move your finger. Right? Simple thing. And tell us the exact instant you become aware that you've decided to move. So they sit and they wait, and at some moment, they say, now, right? After they move their wrist or their finger, and they move. And Libet has it all. He has a movement, the reported movement, a moment of choosing, and he has the brain waves associated with all this choosing. And what he discovers is this. Before people know they've decided to move, before conscious awareness ever wakes up and claims ownership, the brain is already ramping activity to the motor cortex. So about 550 milliseconds before movement, neural preparations are underway. But conscious awareness of deciding only shows up 200 milliseconds before movement. Right? So meaning, for roughly 350 milliseconds, the body's already preparing, the brain's already committed, something is already acting, and yet consciousness shows up late on the scene and says, oh yeah, that was my choice, I'm doing that. Strange, yeah? Kind of almost sounds a lot like karmic momentum, the way we talk about it. Yeah? All the conditioning, all the unhealed wounds, all of our fear and trauma, craving, memory, and this really iron, monolithic story, everything your nervous system is carrying forward, everything the events in history are carrying forward, every survival strategy that once protected you but now controls you, all of that's constantly in motion. By the time we walk into the moment, the karmic river is already roaring. And we begin to wonder, is the goose already cooked? Yeah? But as a part of this, Libet also found something else. He discovered, though, even though the brain starts to fire about 350 milliseconds before we know it, there's a tiny flickering window, about 200 milliseconds, between the movement between the moment when we become conscious of the urge and the moment the muscle actually moves. And in that sliver of time, he found that we have the ability to countermand. We can say, no. And so Libet calls this free won't. Free won't. He says, we might not be able to stop the karmic wave from rising in the brain, but we have the capacity to refuse to let it reach the shore. And this is the gap, this is the pause. It means that even if the river of conditioning is very fast and is already roaring, you're not just a small, powerless leaf being swept away. You're the one who can plant that oar in the water mat, clear through to the basin of the stream. You can't control necessarily what the nervous system suggests, but you can absolutely channel how it manifests through your volition. Sometimes the most awake thing that we can do isn't to dance, right? But to stop the momentum before that dance and before those steps turn into harm. We often get lulled into a feeling that Zen is about doing something holy or righteous or wholesome. But in that 200 millisecond gap, then is sometimes the courage to not do what the ghost of your past is screaming for you to do. And the Christian tradition is also not silent on this. St. Paul says, "For that good which I would do, I do not. And the evil which I would not do, that I do." It's in Romans. This is the split, right? It's the experience of being dragged by something older and deeper than our decision-making ability. And then in sitting with this, it's almost as if Jean-Paul Sartre walked into the room. And instead of calming anything down in my mind, he turned the temperature up even higher, because Sartre insists we don't live as detached spectators analyzing our choices. We're already acting. We're already revealing ourselves. We're already engaging in the world. And this takes us right into the center of what has to be said out loud. Before reflection, before self-analysis, before explanation, before justification, it's flowing. Consciousness is not first an idea. Consciousness is lived, it's embodied. It's already in motion. Sartre says that every act of consciousness towards the world is already accompanied by a non-positional awareness of the self, meaning that we are already ourselves in action before we ever think about ourselves in action. Reflection comes later, right? It narrates, it excuses, it blames, it spiritualizes. It also lies. But now, Libet, Paul, and Sartre stand in the same storm, saying in three very different languages, freedom isn't exactly always what you imagine it to be. You're not sitting safely above your life, making decisions that are detached from reality. You're already moving. You're already committing and are committed. You're already revealing your life before you can explain it or even recognize it. So it's not theory now, whether we're determined or free, or whether we're somewhere in some position in between. Ultimately, we just have to live. We still act, we still harm, we still inherit suffering, and far too often we still pass that suffering forward. So if karmic momentum is real, and if the river is roaring, and if something in us is already acting before we ever consciously choose, then what is responsibility? What is freedom? What is awakening? And right there, into that tension, our practice emerges, right? There's a case in the Hekigan Roku. It's the 74th case. It's called Chinyu and the Rice Pail. Every day at mealtime, Master Chinyu Zenji would personally lift the great rice pail, step out in front of the monk's hall, and do a kind of joyful dance. Laughing aloud, he would call out, "Bodhisattvas, come and eat." Teishō said, for him to act like this, Chinyu was not good-hearted. Later, a monk asked Choke, when that old master said, "Bodhisattvas, come eat," what did he mean? And Choke replied, "It's much like joyful praise at the time of a meal." That's the case. Simple. But if you actually sit with it, allow it to expand within you, it's ferocious. So, first, the characters. The characters aren't props, they're living forces, right? They each bring something profound into the conversation. Master Chinyu Zenji doesn't have a lot of information about him on the historical record. He isn't recorded because he gave brilliant talks. He isn't recorded because he structured a school. We have no remaining written treatises from him. There's no philosophical frameworks that he promulgated or exegesis that he did that was astounding, right? He just shows up because he embodied something. Generations later, we're still looking at him because of that. He took responsibility for feeding the community personally, and he became that role. He didn't just feed them, he didn't drag his feet into the kitchen muttering about duty. Yeah? He didn't present himself as a pious servant leader in some sad holy posture. He danced. He laughed. He lifted the rice pail like a sacred offering. And he called out into the world, "Bodhisattvas, come eat." He calls them bodhisattvas. Not potential bodhisattvas, not theoretical awakened ones. Yeah. Already bodhisattvas, already complete and whole as they are. He doesn't think about compassion or analyze the virtue of generosity. He doesn't reflect on what it means to be grateful. He simply is already in motion. He's a living embodiment of what we just explored with Sartre. Before realization or reflection, before conceptualization, before the mind narrates a pious story, he acts. It's the pre-reflective life, right? In flesh and bone. It's what service looks like before ego gets a hold of it. And then we have Sensei Juken. Many of you have been well acquainted with him, whether you knew it or not. He's the compiler of the Blue Cliff Record, right? So he's a poet master who put all that together. And his role is important here because he refuses to let us sentimentalize Chinyu. If Chinyu is the bright, burning embodiment, then Sensei, in this case, is the analytical razor. He comes forward and says, don't get confused. In acting like this, Chinyu wasn't good-hearted. Now, this sounds pretty harsh. What Sensei is doing is preventing us from moralizing the story. Saying, don't reflect or don't reduce this into, isn't that such a pious activity? Isn't that sweet? He fed the monks so nicely and nobly. Don't think this is about performance or sacrifice. He's not going to allow us to turn it into a sermon about being good people. Because when you name it as goodness, you've already left the living fire and step back into the reflection that creates ego and reinforces identity back into the very karmic machinery that churns out all of our suffering. Sensei is protecting the mystery from becoming something domesticated, something analytical. And then we have Choke. Choke is a master of grounded clarity. Yeah. He represents calm realization in this conversation. A monk comes to him later and says, when the ancient master says, bodhisattvas come eat, what did he mean? And Choke says, it's much like joyful noise at the time of a meal. On the surface, it may look like he trivialized it, or he created like a hallmark moment out of it. Yeah? Yeah. But really, having reflected on Libet and Paul, and already seen the stream of karmic momentum, and Sartre's pre-reflective cogito, yeah, Choke's line lands a little bit differently. He isn't saying, oh, it's cute. He was just being joyful. He's saying, if you look only at the outside, it may look like joy. It may look like festivity. It may look like Thanksgiving. But don't be fooled by those, how do you say it? That chaff. Yeah? He's gesturing to the underlying truth that life, this is life expressed freely. This is the world feeding itself. This is a joy that arises because the self has dropped away and only nourishment remains. It may look like joyful praise, yeah, but you can't manufacture it, and you can't decide to become this. This is what happens when the chains of karmic momentum break open and we're able to steer wisely instead of just being carried mindlessly downstream. This is what it looks like when a human being is no longer primarily living from reflection, but from the pre-reflective cogito we named earlier, Sartre. However, we have a different name for it in our tradition, right? We call it embodying our true nature. Yeah. Not just getting a look at the face that we had before our mother was born, but actually discerning the emotion and discerning the realization and actually being moved by those very eyes. It's a life lived prior to reflection rather than after justification. This is why we practice. We don't read these texts and then paint little shoe prints on the floor showing us how to do the dance. Yeah? The dance dances us. It's not something that we can learn in the traditional way. It's something that we have to yield to. Something that we have to get out of that narrative of self and actually just surrender and relinquish ourselves to. So we have Teishō saying he's not good-hearted. Kind of a mystifying line, right? It certainly looks like he's being very good-hearted. That's not what he means at all. If you interpret this as, look at how nice Chinyu is, you've already flattened it. Yeah? Flattened it into some stale notion of virtue. But in that, you've also evoked ego into identity construction. Good-hearted Chinyu becomes a story we tell ourselves, and the stories that come alive only upon reflection. We have to move past that. That's why the essential part of our practice is actually sitting and studying the self well. Because in studying the self, we become aware of how we construct it, become aware of all of its devices. And only through that radical, brutal honesty of allowing ourselves to admit that we're not always in control, matter of fact, we seldom, if ever, are, that constructed ego can't somehow impose itself on the world, can we actually begin to rest in and trust the nature that's already present within us through practice. Does this mean that we become immoral beings? No. It means that we become truly moral beings. It means that we, instead of trying to force some notion of our morality on the situation, that we actually begin to become the practice imperative that that situation demands, that we're actualized by what's present fully. It's a practice about getting out of our heads and truly not just joining the dance, because that requires a conscious effort to do it, but accepting the dance as it presents itself. Learning to turn the bull and turn karmic proclivities that cause suffering into something that actually begins to feed and nourish people. Accepting everything that life presents, including what we consider to be our missteps, as something that we can use as a pointer to awakening. I say all of this because we often get stuck in some idea of what we're going to do, or how we're going to do it. And of course, it's good to have intentions in that way, or even goals. But even more important is that we sit patiently and watch it arise, and watch conditions as they emerge, and ourselves step into the dance. Not theoretically, but practically. So this week, as everything gets thick, and as the recriminations come up that we're not sitting enough, that we're not good enough, set all that to the side and instead look at what's right in front of us. Look at how we're called to action, and embody that. The longer you sit and reflect on where you're falling short, the further estranged you become from your life. Now you see why I ended meditation early. A little longer than normal.
The saying of Viktor Frankl, you may be familiar with.
Yeah, I know his work.
Between perception and reaction, there's a space.
Mm.
And that space lies our only freedom.
Mm-hmm. I just, it seemed like an appropriate. I read the case. I said, it's just so deceptively simple. Many of you have already had it and passed it, and it's easy to pass, right? Or theoretically pass. But there's so much there that we miss. And, we live a life sometimes where we're like, I just want to stop the water. Yeah. Or create a dam and try to divert it in a way, or channel the water in a way where it, passes through a scenery that I much prefer, a speed that I'd rather do. And that's not what this practice is all about. And we become paralyzed by that. So in a way, it's really just about seeing how the dance is unfolded and directing the activity or the rushing stream of our karmic reality in a way that ameliorates suffering as we find it. So, just got to get out of our heads and start doing. Start doing.